Hello, and welcome to Dreamtime History. Imagine standing atop the Acropolis in Athens on a quiet night. Beneath your feet, beneath the marble ruins of the Parthenon, beneath centuries of stone and soil, lie the forgotten foundations of a far older city. Long before democracy, before philosophy, before temples gleamed white in Mediterranean sun, this rocky hill was crowned with massive walls of rough-cut stone, a Bronze Age fortress lost to memory. 3,500 years ago, Mycenaean Athens thrived here, yet today almost nothing remains visible above ground. No archives survived, no palace stands, only silence and stones reused a dozen times over. So who lived in this lost citadel? What systems held their society together, and why did this ancient Athens vanish so completely that even later Athenians forgot it ever existed? But before we descend into the past, please take a moment to like and subscribe. I'd also love to know where in the world you're joining me tonight. Leave a comment below. To understand the lost city beneath the Acropolis, you must first step back into a world almost unimaginably distant from our own, a world we call the Bronze Age. This was an era that stretched across the eastern Mediterranean for more than 1,000 years, a time when copper and tin were smelted together to create the hardest metal yet known to human hands, when vast palace complexes rose on hilltops across mainland Greece, and when ships heavy with cargo threaded between islands under oar and sail. The civilization that archaeologists have named Mycenaean Greece flourished roughly from 1750 to 1050 before the Common Era, and it represents the first complex society to take root on Greek soil. This was a world before Homer, before the alphabet, before anything we might recognize as classical Hellenic culture, yet it was sophisticated, organized, and deeply connected to the wider networks of Bronze Age trade and power that bound together Egypt, Anatolia, the Levant, and the Aegean. The Mycenaean world was not a unified empire in any modern sense. Rather, it was a patchwork of regional centres, fortified citadels perched on defensible heights, each controlling its surrounding territory through a combination of military might, ritual authority, and economic redistribution. The greatest of these centres were places like Mycenae itself, with its famous Lion Gate and treasury tombs packed with gold, Tiryns with its impossibly thick walls, Pylos on the western coast with its well-preserved palace and clay tablets recording administrative minutiae in the script we call Linear B. These were palatial societies, hierarchical and centralised, where scribes tallied sheep and grain and bronze ingots, where artisans worked under palace patronage, and where kings or monarchs ruled with both earthly and perhaps sacred authority. Athens, or more properly Attica, the region surrounding the rocky prominence we now call the Acropolis, was part of this Bronze Age world, but it stood somewhat apart from the greatest centres of power. No massive palace complex has been found there to rival Mycenae or Pylos. No archives of Linear B tablets have emerged from the rock to tell us who ruled or how many jars of olive oil were stored in royal storerooms. Yet Athens was not insignificant. The hill itself, rising steeply from the plain, offered a natural fortress, difficult to assault, easy to defend, visible for miles around. And archaeology has revealed that during the late Bronze Age, massive fortification walls were indeed raised around the summit, walls built in the same Cyclopean style as those at Mycenae and Tiryns, using enormous blocks of limestone fitted together without mortar, each stone so heavy that later Greeks would believe only the mythical Cyclopes could have moved them into place. Before the citadel rose, before the walls were built, Attica was a land of small communities scattered across a landscape of rolling hills, narrow valleys, and coastal plains. The geography of this region has always shaped human life here. To the north and east lie mountains, Parn, Pentelicon, Hymettus, their slopes covered in scrub and pine, their valleys offering pasture and shelter. To the south and west the land opens toward the sea, the Saronic Gulf with its islands and harbours. The soil is not uniformly rich. Limestone bedrock lies close to the surface in many places, but where deeper soil accumulated, olives, grapes, and grain could be cultivated. Water, always precious in this Mediterranean climate, flowed in seasonal streams and could be found in springs tucked into hillsides. The earliest inhabitants of Attica lived in rhythm with these geographic realities. They hunted deer and wild boar in the forested uplands. They fished the coasts and gathered shellfish. They herded sheep and goats across stony pastures, following the seasons up into the hills in summer and down to sheltered valleys in winter. Slowly, over centuries, they learned to plant barley and wheat, to tend olive groves and vineyards, to store surplus grain in large clay jars buried in the earth. They built simple houses of mud brick and timber, often clustered together for mutual protection, and they buried their dead in cist graves or chamber tombs cut into soft rock, placing pottery vessels and bronze tools alongside the bodies for whatever journey lay ahead. These were not isolated communities. Even in the earliest phases of the Bronze Age, trade networks connected Attica to the wider Aegean world. Obsidian from the island of Melos, volcanic glass prized for its sharp cutting edge, has been found in Attic settlements dating back thousands of years before the rise of Mycenaean palaces. Pottery styles shifted and changed as new influences arrived by sea. Bronze itself, requiring both copper and tin, neither of which is found in abundance in Attica, had to be imported through networks of exchange that stretched across the Mediterranean and beyond. As the Bronze Age matured and palatial centres rose elsewhere in Greece, the communities of Attica began to coalesce around the Acropolis. The hill was strategic, commanding the best routes through the region and offering a refuge in troubled times. Perhaps a local chieftain or early king claimed the rock as his seat. Perhaps the communities of the plain agreed to fortify it collectively, pooling labour and resources to raise those massive walls. We cannot know for certain. But by the late Bronze Age, the Acropolis had become what the outline of its fortifications still suggests: a citadel, a stronghold, the beating heart of a regional polity that, while never rivaling the great palaces to the south and west, nonetheless participated in the wider Mycenaean world, adopting its architectural styles, its burial customs, its hierarchies of power and prestige. This, then, was the foundation upon which Bronze Age Athens rose, a landscape of stone and sea, a people shaped by seasonal rhythms and limited resources, a citadel on a rock where ambition met geography, and human hands began the long work of building something that might endure. The Acropolis rises roughly 150 metres above the surrounding plain, a limestone outcrop with sheer cliffs on three sides, and a more gradual western approach. If you could somehow stand on that rock as it appeared in the late Bronze Age, perhaps around 1300 years before the Common Era, you would find yourself within a world utterly transformed from the natural hillside. The summit had been levelled and enlarged, cut and filled to create a more usable platform. Around the perimeter, massive fortification walls enclosed the space, walls built in the style archaeologists have named Cyclopean after the mythical giants. Enormous blocks of roughly dressed limestone, some weighing several tons, fitted together without mortar, their irregular faces creating an interlocking puzzle of stone. These walls were not delicate or ornamental. They were thick, functional, meant to withstand assault. In places they may have stood 5 or 6 metres high, their outer faces sloping slightly inward for stability, their inner faces backing onto fill and earth. Along the western approach, where the natural slope was gentlest and thus most vulnerable, the fortifications were most elaborate, bastions projecting outward to allow defenders to fire upon attackers from multiple angles, narrow gateways that could be easily defended, passages that forced anyone entering to turn at sharp angles, exposing their unshielded right side. The whole system was designed not for show, but for survival, a testament to a world in which violence was common enough that even a citadel needed to be prepared for siege. Within those walls stood the palace, though almost nothing of it survives today. Later construction, centuries of rebuilding, the great temples of the classical era, the foundations of Byzantine churches, Ottoman structures, has obliterated nearly all trace of the Bronze Age buildings that once crowned the rock. Archaeologists have found fragments, scattered clues buried beneath later levels, a few column bases cut into the bedrock, some courses of wall foundations, a section of stairway leading nowhere, its upper steps vanished. These hints suggest a structure built in the Megaron style typical of Mycenaean palaces, a rectangular great hall with a central hearth, surrounded by porches and smaller rooms, oriented toward the southern exposure to catch the winter sun and avoid the bitter northern winds that sweep down from the mountains. Imagine, if you can, what that palace might have looked like in its time. The walls would have been constructed of stone foundations supporting mud brick and timber framing. The roof would have been pitched, covered in clay tiles or perhaps thatch. Wooden columns, their bases set into stone sockets, would have supported porches and interior spaces. The floors might have been packed earth or clay, perhaps covered with woven mats or animal hides in the most important rooms. Frescoes painted plaster may have decorated interior walls, though no trace of such decoration has survived at Athens. At other Mycenaean sites, these frescoes depict processions, bull-leaping, warfare, abstract geometric patterns, vivid colours of red ochre, yellow, blue, black, white, bringing life and warmth to stone and timber. The Great Hall, the Megaron, would have been the heart of the complex, the space where the ruler presided, where feasts were held, where oaths were sworn and gifts exchanged. A circular hearth would have occupied the centre, its flames casting flickering light on the surrounding columns and walls. Smoke would have risen through a hole in the roof, perhaps covered with a small clay structure to keep out rain. Around the hearth, one might imagine benches or stools, storage jars set against walls, weapons hung on pegs, spears, swords of bronze, shields of leather stretched over wooden frames. The smell of wood smoke, of cooking meat, of oil lamps burning with wicks of twisted flax, the sound of voices, footsteps on stone, the scrape of pottery, the distant call of goats from somewhere down the hill. But you must remember, all of this is reconstruction, informed speculation based on parallels with better preserved sites elsewhere. The palace at Athens has left almost no physical trace. The column bases and foundation stones tell us something was here, something substantial, but they cannot tell us the full story. We infer from the presence of cyclopean fortifications that a palace stood within, because such massive defensive works would not have been raised to protect an empty hilltop or a simple village. We infer from the regional pattern that a local ruler, call him a king, a chieftain, a wonax in the Greek term preserved on Linear B tablets from other sites, made this his seat of power. We infer from the geographical reality that whoever controlled the Acropolis controlled the best routes through Attica, the best harbour access, the richest agricultural lands nearby. What sort of ruler might he have been? The evidence from other Mycenaean centres suggests a figure of considerable authority, combining military leadership with administrative oversight and perhaps ritual or religious functions. The palace was not merely a residence but a command centre, a storehouse, a redistribution hub, a place where tribute was collected from surrounding villages and then reallocated to support craftsmen, warriors, administrators, priests. The ruler would have been supported by a retinue of lesser elites, relatives, companions in arms, specialists in various crafts and skills. Below them, a hierarchy of dependents, servants, peasants bound to the land, slaves captured in raids or born into servitude. The palace itself, perched high on the rock, would have served multiple functions simultaneously. It was fortress, refuge, symbol of power, economic centre, ritual space. When danger threatened, raiders from the sea, hostile forces from neighbouring territories, the people of the surrounding countryside could retreat within its walls, driving their livestock up the slopes, carrying what goods they could save. The massive fortifications suggest this was not a theoretical danger, but a real one, experienced often enough that enormous labour and resources were devoted to defence. The world of the late Bronze Age was not peaceful. Competition for resources, territorial disputes, slave raiding, piracy, all were common enough that every significant centre had to be prepared to defend itself, and the Acropolis, for all its natural strength, was made stronger still by human hands shaping stone into walls that would endure for millennia. A fortress on a rocky hill presents certain unavoidable challenges, and the most pressing of these is water. Human beings can survive for weeks without food if necessary, but only days without water. A citadel, no matter how imposing its walls or strategic its position, becomes a death trap rather than a refuge if it cannot provide water to those sheltering within. The Acropolis, for all its natural advantages, had no surface springs, no streams flowing across its summit. Rain could be collected during the winter months, but the long, dry summers of the Mediterranean, months without a drop falling from cloudless skies, demanded more permanent solutions. Any community intending to hold the rock through a siege or simply to maintain year-round occupation needed to solve this fundamental problem of supply. We know from other Mycenaean sites that Bronze Age engineers were fully capable of sophisticated water management. At Mycenae itself, a secret cistern was carved deep into the rock within the citadel walls, connected to a natural spring outside the fortifications by an underground passage. Workers had tunnelled through solid limestone, cutting a narrow corridor that dropped, steeply downward, lined with stone steps slippery with moisture. In times of siege, defenders could descend into this hidden passage and draw water without exposing themselves to enemy observation or attack. The cistern at the bottom, fed by the spring, could hold enough water to sustain the citadel's population for months. Similar systems have been found at other sites, at Tiryns, at Athens' neighbour Eleusis, evidence that Mycenaean builders understood the principles of hydrology, of channeling and storing water, of creating redundancy in case one source failed. At Athens, the evidence for such systems is fragmentary but suggestive. Later accounts, preserved in classical Greek sources written many centuries after the Bronze Age, speak of hidden springs and secret passages on the Acropolis, stories that may preserve dim memories of actual Bronze Age infrastructure. Modern archaeological investigation has revealed traces of rock-cut channels and hollows on the northern slope of the hill, features that might have been part of a water collection or storage system. Natural fissures in the limestone may have been enlarged and shaped to catch rainwater, directing it into carved cisterns or underground chambers where it could be stored out of the sun, protected from evaporation. Large clay storage jars, pithoi as the Greeks called them, could have been sunk into the ground or placed in cool subterranean rooms, each capable of holding hundreds of litres of water, their mouths sealed with clay stoppers or flat stones to keep the contents clean. Imagine yourself as one of the workers tasked with maintaining these systems. You rise before dawn on a winter morning when rain has fallen during the night. The rock is slick and dark with moisture. You descend carefully along a narrow path, perhaps a stairway cut into the stone, moving from the upper precincts of the citadel down toward the northern face where the cisterns lie. The air is cold, your breath visible in the dim light. You carry an oil lamp, its small flame wavering as you move, casting shadows that leap and dance across wet stone. Around you, the fortress is stirring. Voices from the palace above, the bleat of goats, the creak of wooden gates opening to admit farmers from the surrounding countryside, bringing the day's deliveries of grain and oil and wine. You reach the cistern entrance, a low opening half hidden by overhanging rock. Inside, the chamber widens, the ceiling lost in darkness above. Water gleams in the lamplight, filling a basin carved from the living rock. You dip a wooden bucket, testing the level. Good, the night's rain has replenished what was drawn yesterday. The water is cold, clean, tasting faintly of stone. You make a mental note, perhaps scratching a mark on the wall with a piece of charcoal, a way of tracking supply, of knowing when the cistern needs attention or when drought threatens to exhaust the reserve. This is not glamorous work, not the stuff of legends or songs sung in the Megaron at night, but it is essential. Without this water, the mighty walls mean nothing. Without this water, the palace becomes uninhabitable, the fortress a hollow shell. Beyond water, the citadel needed food in quantities sufficient to sustain not only the royal household but also the servants, craftsmen, guards and priests who made up the permanent population, as well as refugees from the countryside in times of danger. This meant storage, granaries for wheat and barley, storerooms for oil and wine, chambers for preserved foods, areas for fodder to keep livestock alive through lean times. Archaeological evidence from better preserved Mycenaean palaces shows rows of storage magazines, long narrow rooms lined with massive clay jars set into the floor. Some of these vessels stood taller than a human being, their surfaces decorated with abstract patterns or left plain, their interiors coated with resin or plaster to make them watertight or grain-tight. The palace at Pylos had extensive storage facilities, capable of holding many thousands of litres of olive oil, dozens of tons of grain, countless amphorae of wine. Athens, though smaller, would have needed similar provisions scaled to its population and hinterland. The logistics of supply were constant, never-ending. Every day, carts and pack animals would have climbed the slopes bringing produce from the surrounding farms. Village headmen would have appeared with their tribute, a portion of the harvest owed to the ruler who protected them, who administered justice, who maintained the roads and water sources they depended on. Scribes, had any existed at Athens, would have tallied these arrivals, tracking what came in and what went out, ensuring that the balance was maintained, that enough was stored against future need while still providing for present consumption. This was the unglamorous reality beneath the grandeur, not heroic deeds or mythic conflicts, but the patient, methodical work of ensuring that people had enough to drink, enough to eat, enough to survive another season, another year, another generation on this high rock between the mountains and the sea. Beyond the fortified rock, stretching in all directions across the landscape of Attica, lay the true substance of Bronze Age Athens, not the palace or the cyclopean walls, but the villages, farms, workshops and pastures that sustained human life in this corner of the Greek world. The citadel may have been the visible symbol of power, the seat from which authority emanated, but it was the countryside that provided the grain and oil and wine, the wool and leather and timber, the bronze and clay and stone that made civilization possible. Without the labour of farmers and herders, artisans and traders, the palace on the Acropolis would have been nothing more than an empty monument, its halls silent, its storerooms bare, its ruler powerless. Imagine yourself standing not on the rock itself but down in the plain on a summer morning during the height of the Mycenaean age, perhaps around 1200 years before the Common Era. The sun rises over the mountains to the east, flooding the landscape with golden light. The air is already warm, carrying the scent of wild thyme and oregano, the buzz of insects, the distant bleating of goats being driven to pasture. Around you, the land rolls in gentle swells, patches of cultivated fields alternating with scrubland and rocky outcrops, stands of oak and pine in the valleys where water collects, the whitewashed walls of a village visible on a nearby hillside, smoke rising from cooking fires. This is a world of small communities, rarely more than a few dozen households clustered together for mutual support and protection. The houses are modest structures, their foundations of fieldstone, their walls of mud brick reinforced with timber beams, their roofs thatched with reeds or covered with clay tiles. Each house opens onto a small courtyard where the family keeps chickens, perhaps a pig, storage jars for grain and oil, a loom for weaving, a grinding stone for processing wheat into flour. The rhythms of life here are ancient, dictated by the seasons and the demands of agriculture. In autumn, the olive harvest, with everyone from the village working together to beat the trees and gather the fallen fruit, pressing it for oil that will provide light, food, medicine and trade goods through the coming year. In spring, the barley and wheat must be harvested before the grain shatters and falls to the ground. In summer, grapes ripen on terraced hillsides, their juice destined for wine that will sustain households through winter and serve as a valuable commodity for exchange. The people who work these fields are not slaves, though slavery certainly existed in the Mycenaean world. Most are free farmers, heads of families who owe obligations to the ruler on the Acropolis, but who maintain control over their own labour and their own small plots of land. Some of these obligations are paid in kind, a portion of the harvest delivered to the citadel's storerooms, a certain number of days' labour on public works, participation in military service when called upon. Other obligations might be ritual or ceremonial, attendance at festivals, offerings to the gods under the auspices of the palace priesthood, acknowledgement of the ruler's authority through gestures of deference and respect. The citadel presides over this landscape not through constant direct intervention, but through a system of reciprocal relationships that, while certainly hierarchical and unequal, nonetheless functions through mutual dependence rather than pure coercion. The ruler and his retinue need the produce of the countryside to sustain themselves, to support the specialists, craftsmen, warriors, priests, scribes who make up the palace establishment, to store surplus against times of scarcity, to demonstrate their wealth and power through feasting and gift-giving. The farmers and villagers, in turn, need the protection the citadel provides, a refuge in times of danger, military force to deter raiders, adjudication of disputes that might otherwise escalate into blood feuds, maintenance of communal infrastructure such as roads and water sources, and perhaps most importantly, participation in larger networks of exchange that bring prestige goods, information, and security from beyond the immediate region. We can imagine how this system might have worked in practice by looking at the better documented Mycenaean centres, where linear B tablets have preserved administrative records. At Pylos, scribes tallied sheep by the thousands, recording their allocation to shepherds, their movements between seasonal pastures, their expected wool yields. They tracked oil production, noting which villages owed how much, which had delivered their quota, which were in arrears. They recorded bronze allotments to smiths, specifying what each craftsman was expected to produce. So many spearheads, so many swords, so many tools for agriculture. The tablets reveal a society of meticulous accounting, of central redistribution, of economic relationships formalized and tracked with bureaucratic precision. Athens likely operated on a smaller scale, lacking the extensive administrative apparatus of the great palatial centres. But the basic pattern would have been similar. Village headmen would have reported to officials at the citadel, perhaps travelling there at regular intervals, monthly, or at key points in the agricultural calendar, to present their offerings and receive instructions or materials. Craftsmen might have worked both in the palace workshops and in village settings, some directly supported by the ruler, others producing for local consumption and regional trade. Metalworkers in particular would have been valued specialists, their skills essential for producing the bronze tools and weapons that gave Mycenaean civilization its technological edge over societies still relying primarily on stone and wood. The social hierarchy was clear and consequential. At the apex stood the ruler and his immediate family living in the palace on the rock, enjoying the finest foods, the most elaborate possessions, the greatest security. Below them, a class of lesser elites, military companions, wealthy landowners, religious officiants, skilled craftsmen working in precious materials, people who shared in the benefits of proximity to power while remaining distinctly subordinate to it. And below them, the vast majority, farmers, shepherds, labourers, servants, whose lives were shaped by endless toil, whose prospects were constrained by birth and circumstance, whose names and stories have vanished entirely from the archaeological record. This was not an egalitarian society, it was not a democracy. It was a Bronze Age chiefdom or early state, characterized by hierarchy, tribute, and the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a small elite sustained by the labour of many. To understand Bronze Age Athens, you must look beyond the palace walls and fortifications to the material culture that sustained daily life. The objects people made and used, the skills they mastered, the networks of exchange that connected this corner of Attica to the wider Aegean world. Bronze itself, the defining metal of the age, was the product of sophisticated metallurgical knowledge. Pure copper, though workable, is too soft for most practical applications. But when alloyed with tin in roughly the right proportions, about 9 parts copper to 1 part tin, the resulting bronze is harder, more durable, capable of holding a sharper edge than either metal alone. The problem, of course, was that neither copper nor tin occurred naturally in Attica in quantities sufficient to sustain local demand. Both had to be imported, copper perhaps from Cyprus or other sources in the eastern Mediterranean, tin from even more distant origins, possibly as far as Afghanistan or Cornwall. This meant that bronze was never cheap or common, never a material to be wasted or used carelessly. The production of bronze objects required specialized knowledge and considerable skill. A smith working in bronze needed to understand heat, to recognize the color changes in metal as it approached working temperature, to know when to hammer and when to allow cooling, to master the techniques of casting molten metal into molds carved from stone or formed from clay. The tools of the trade were themselves valuable: hammers and tongs, crucibles that could withstand extreme heat, anvils of hard stone, files and chisels for finishing work. A master bronzesmith might work within the palace precincts, directly supported by the ruler, producing weapons and prestige items for the elite, swords with ivory-inlaid hilts, spearheads with sockets expertly formed, daggers decorated with inlaid designs in precious metals. Other smiths might work in village settings, producing more utilitarian objects: knives, axe heads, chisels, sickles, fish hooks, pins for fastening clothing. Every piece represented an investment of imported raw material, skilled labour, and controlled fire. Pottery, by contrast, was ubiquitous. Clay was abundant in Attica, available in streambeds and hillsides, requiring no long-distance trade to obtain. Every settlement would have had potters, craftspeople who understood how to prepare clay, removing stones and debris, adding temper, crushed shell, or grog to prevent cracking during firing, kneading the material to remove air bubbles, forming vessels on a wheel that spun under the potter's hands. The shapes were functional, refined through generations of use: large storage jars for grain and oil, smaller amphorae for transporting wine, wide shallow bowls for mixing and serving food, narrow-necked jugs for pouring, cups for drinking. Some pottery was left plain, the natural colour of fired clay. Other pieces were decorated with painted designs, geometric patterns, abstract motifs, occasionally stylized representations of plants or animals applied with slip, a liquid clay that fired to a different colour than the body of the vessel. These were not luxury goods but everyday objects, yet they reveal much about the society that produced them. The standardization of forms suggests shared traditions, communication between potters in different villages, perhaps even itinerant craftspeople who moved from place to place. The decorative styles connect Attic pottery to broader Mycenaean patterns, showing that this region was not isolated but participated in cultural trends that stretched across the Greek mainland and islands. When archaeologists excavate Bronze Age sites in Attica, they find pottery shards by the thousands, broken vessels discarded when cracked or chipped, accumulated over generations of habitation, preserving subtle changes in style and technique that allow relative dating of different occupation layers. Imagine yourself as a craftsman in one of the villages below the Acropolis, perhaps a carpenter working with the tools available in that distant time. You rise with first light, your small house still cool from the night. Outside, the air smells of wood smoke from neighbouring hearths, of bread baking in clay ovens, of animals stirring in their pens. You walk to your workshop, a simple structure with 3 walls and an open front to admit light and air. Your tools hang on the wall or rest on a worn wooden bench, bronze axes for felling trees and rough shaping, adzes for smoothing surfaces, chisels for joinery, a saw with a blade of bronze that must be carefully maintained because replacement is expensive. Today you're working on a doorframe for one of the houses in the village, a commission from a family prosperous enough to afford such refinement. The wood is olive, dense and difficult but beautiful when finished, resistant to rot and insect damage. You have already shaped the posts and lintel, and now you are cutting the mortise joints that will hold the frame together. The work requires patience, precision, and understanding of how wood behaves, where it is likely to split, how grain direction affects strength, how much clearance to allow for seasonal expansion and contraction in the changing humidity. Your hands move with practiced confidence, feeling the resistance of the wood, listening to the subtle sounds that tell you when the chisel is cutting cleanly or when it is about to bind. Wood shavings curl away from the blade, falling to the packed earth floor where they will later be swept up and used for kindling or bedding for animals. This is skilled work, respected in the community, but it is not exalted. You are neither wealthy nor destitute, occupying a middle position in the village hierarchy. You own your tools, your workshop, a small plot of land where your wife grows vegetables and keeps chickens. You exchange your labour for grain from farmers, oil from those with larger olive groves, pottery from the village potter, perhaps cloth woven by other households. Sometimes you work for the palace, fulfilling an obligation or accepting a commission, repairing gates, building storage structures, crafting ceremonial objects for rituals. The relationship is neither purely coercive nor purely voluntary, but something in between, shaped by custom, by mutual need, by the unspoken understanding that the social order requires each person to fulfill their role. The walls themselves deserve closer attention, for they are perhaps the most enduring testament to Bronze Age Athens that remains visible today, even if only as fragmentary foundations and scattered stones. These were not ordinary walls, not simple barriers hastily erected to mark territory or keep livestock contained. They were massive constructions, built to withstand assault, to intimidate potential attackers, to proclaim the power and determination of those who raised them. The style of construction that archaeologists call Cyclopean takes its name from later Greek mythology, from the belief that only the Cyclopes, one-eyed giants of immense strength, could have moved such enormous stones into place. The blocks themselves varied in size, some merely large, others truly monumental, weighing several tons apiece. They were roughly shaped, their faces irregular, fitted together with careful attention to stability and strength, but without the precision coursing of later Greek architecture. The result was a wall that appeared almost organic, as if it had grown from the living rock rather than being assembled by human hands. To build such walls required not only technical knowledge but also social organization on a considerable scale. The stone had to be quarried, most likely from outcrops nearby where the bedrock came close to the surface. Workers would have split the limestone using techniques ancient even then, driving wooden wedges into natural cracks, soaking the wood with water so it expanded and fractured the stone, levering the resulting blocks free, shaping them roughly with bronze tools or simply accepting their natural forms. Each block then had to be moved to the construction site, dragged on wooden sledges or rolled on logs, hauled up the slopes of the Acropolis by teams of men straining against rope, encouraged perhaps by rhythmic chanting or the beat of drums, the work dangerous and exhausting under the Mediterranean sun. The placement of each stone was critical. Too little attention to how blocks rested upon one another and the wall might shift, develop weak points, eventually collapse under its own weight or the pressure of earth fill behind it. The builders had to understand load distribution, how to alternate large and small stones, how to tilt blocks slightly inward for stability, how to bind outer and inner faces together with through stones that spanned the wall's thickness. This was knowledge accumulated over generations, passed from master builder to apprentice, refined through experience and occasionally through catastrophic failure. The walls around the Acropolis in their surviving fragments show that the builders knew their craft. Where sections remain in place after more than 3,000 years, the stone still sits solidly, weathered but unshaken, a testament to human skill and determination. But walls alone do not make a fortress impregnable. The greatest vulnerability of any fortified place is its gates, the necessary openings through which people and goods must pass, the points where defensive advantage is most easily compromised. The western approach to the Acropolis, where the natural slope was gentlest and thus most vulnerable to attack, received particular attention from the Bronze Age builders. Archaeological evidence suggests a complex entrance system, though much has been destroyed or obscured by later construction. The gate itself would have been narrow, perhaps wide enough for a single cart or a few people walking abreast, forcing any attacking force to constrict into a column that could be engaged from above. The passage through the fortifications may have turned at sharp angles, creating a series of courtyards or confined spaces where defenders on the walls could rain down spears, stones, arrows upon anyone attempting to force entry. Flanking towers or bastions projected outward from the wall line, allowing defenders to observe and attack anyone approaching the gate from multiple angles. An enemy pressed against the gate attempting to batter it down or set it afire would be exposed to missiles from the front and from both sides, vulnerable in ways that would make such an assault nearly suicidal. The gate itself would have been substantial, heavy timbers reinforced with bronze fittings, barred from within, perhaps protected by an outer screen or additional defensive works. During peacetime, the gate would stand open during daylight hours, allowing the daily flow of traffic, farmers bringing produce, craftsmen delivering goods, officials coming and going, ordinary people pursuing ordinary business. But when danger threatened, the gate could be sealed quickly, transforming the citadel from an open administrative centre into a closed refuge. What do these fortifications tell us about the world in which they were necessary? They speak of a landscape where violence was common enough to justify enormous expenditure of labour and resources on defence. They suggest that the Mycenaean age, for all its cultural achievements and trade networks, was not peaceful. Disputes over territory, over water rights, over grazing lands, over control of trade routes, all these could escalate into armed conflict. Raiding, the seizure of goods and livestock and people from weaker neighbours, was perhaps endemic, a way of demonstrating power and acquiring wealth without the patient work of agriculture and craft. The sea itself, which facilitated trade and communication, also brought danger: pirates, foreign raiders, rival, states launching expeditions to weaken competitors or exact tribute. The walls also reveal something more subtle and perhaps more melancholic: the fundamental insecurity beneath the apparent confidence of Mycenaean civilization. A society at ease, certain of its safety, does not invest so heavily in fortifications. The very existence of these massive walls suggests a world where security could never be taken for granted, where even the most powerful centres felt vulnerable, where the possibility of siege and assault was real enough to demand constant vigilance and preparation. The palace on the Acropolis, for all its administrative sophistication and cultural refinement, existed in a state of permanent alertness, its power dependent not only on economic control and ritual authority, but also on the capacity to defend itself and its dependent territories against those who would destroy or subjugate it. The walls were both a source of strength and an admission of fragility, a recognition that human societies, no matter how carefully organized, remain vulnerable to forces, environmental, social, military, that can overwhelm them if adequate precautions are not taken. To speak of religion in Bronze Age Athens is to enter a realm of profound uncertainty, for almost nothing survives that can tell us directly what people believed, how they worshipped, which gods or spirits they honoured, what rituals they performed to ensure favour or avert disaster. The great temples of classical Athens, those magnificent structures of marble with their elaborate sculptural programs and documented cults, lay centuries in the future. The philosophical and literary tradition that would eventually articulate Greek religious thought in texts we can still read had not yet emerged. We are left with fragments, archaeological traces, analogies drawn from better documented sites, careful inference from material remains, and an obligation to acknowledge how much we simply do not know. What we can say with confidence is that the Acropolis, long before it became the site of the Parthenon and the Erechtheion, almost certainly served religious functions alongside its military and administrative roles. This pattern appears consistently across the Mycenaean world. Citadels were not purely secular centres of political power and economic redistribution, but also sacred spaces where the earthly and divine realms intersected, where rulers derived authority not only from military might and economic control, but also from their connection to supernatural forces, their ability to mediate between human communities and the powers that governed fertility, weather, success in war, protection from disease and disaster. Evidence from other Mycenaean palaces suggests that certain rooms within the palatial complex were dedicated to ritual activities. At Pylos, a room containing a circular hearth, benches around the walls, and deposits of drinking vessels has been interpreted as a cult centre, a place where offerings were made and sacred meals consumed. Similar features have been identified at other sites. The Megaron itself, the great hall where the ruler held court and feasted with his companions, may have had ritual significance, the central hearth not merely a source of warmth and light, but also an altar where sacrifices were burned, where libations were poured, where oaths were sworn with the gods as witnesses. We can imagine, then, a religious life on the Bronze Age Acropolis that was woven into the fabric of daily existence rather than separated into distinct sacred and secular spheres. Morning might begin with offerings at the household hearth, a pinch of grain cast into the fire, a small libation of wine or oil poured onto the ground, words spoken to honour ancestors or household spirits. The ruler, before making important decisions or embarking on significant undertakings, might consult with religious specialists, priests or priestesses who claim to interpret signs, to communicate with divine powers through dreams or trances, or the reading of omens in the flight of birds, the patterns of sacrificial smoke, the behaviour of animals. The hilltop itself, rising from the plain visible from great distances commanding the landscape, may have been understood as inherently sacred even before human hands built walls and palaces upon it. Natural features, springs, caves, distinctive rock formations often held religious significance in pre-modern societies, seen as portals between worlds, dwelling places of spirits or deities. The Acropolis has such features: natural clefts in the rock, caves on the northern slope, areas where water seeped from fissures. All these might have been venerated long before the Bronze Age, and those ancient traditions may have persisted, adapted, incorporated into the religious life of the Mycenaean citadel. Who are the divine powers honoured here? We cannot know with certainty. Later Greek tradition associated the Acropolis with Athena, the goddess of wisdom and warfare, patron of Athens from the classical period onward. Some scholars have suggested that worship of Athena, or a goddess with similar attributes, may extend back into the Bronze Age. Linear B tablets from other sites mention several deities whose names or titles survived into classical Greek religion: Poseidon, Zeus, Hera, Dionysus, suggesting continuity across the divide between Bronze Age and later periods. But the tablets also mention gods whose names are unfamiliar, deities who did not survive the collapse and transformation of Mycenaean civilization, whose cults vanished without leaving clear traces in later tradition. It is perhaps safest to imagine a religious landscape more fluid and diverse than the relatively standardized Olympian pantheon of classical Greece. local variations would have been significant. A goddess worshipped on the Acropolis might have had attributes and associations specific to Athens and its territories, even if she shared general characteristics with goddesses honoured at other Mycenaean centres. Earth goddesses, fertility deities, figures associated with agricultural cycles, with the provision of water, with protection in war. These would have been essential to a society dependent on agriculture, vulnerable to drought, threatened by violence. Ritual practices, we can infer, likely included animal sacrifice, the slaughter of sheep, goats, cattle, pigs, with portions burned as offerings to the gods, the smell of roasting meat rising with smoke toward the sky, and other portions distributed among participants in sacred meals that reinforced social bonds and hierarchies. Who received which cuts of meat? Who was allowed to participate? Who performed the sacrifice? All these would have been governed by rules reflecting and reinforcing social structure. Libations of wine, oil, or honey might have been poured at significant moments, before meals, at the conclusion of agreements, during festivals marking seasonal transitions. Votive offerings, small clay figurines, bronze objects, pottery vessels might have been dedicated at shrines, left as thank offerings or petitions for favour. Yet we must acknowledge the limits of inference. We cannot recover the prayers these people spoke, the myths they told to explain their world, the emotional texture of their religious experience. We cannot know whether they felt terror before their gods or confidence, whether worship brought comfort or anxiety, whether the relationship between human and divine was imagined primarily as transactional, offerings in exchange for protection, or as something more intimate and mysterious. The stones are silent on these questions. The walls give no answers. We are left with shadows, with absence, with the humbling recognition that entire dimensions of human experience have vanished beyond recovery, leaving only the faintest suggestions that something profound once existed here. One of the most striking absences in our knowledge of Bronze Age Athens concerns language and record-keeping. At the great palatial centres of the Mycenaean world, at Pylos on the western coast of the Peloponnese, at Mycenae itself, at Knossos on Crete, archaeologists have recovered archives of clay tablets inscribed with the script we call Linear B. These tablets, preserved accidentally when fires destroyed the palaces and baked the clay hard, contain administrative records of breathtaking detail. They tally livestock by the thousands, record distributions of bronze to smiths, list offerings made to various deities, document landholdings and labour obligations, track shipments of goods between regions. When Michael Ventris deciphered Linear B in 1952, revealing it to be an early form of Greek, these tablets opened a window into the bureaucratic machinery of Mycenaean civilization, allowing scholars to understand with unprecedented precision how these societies were organized, what resources they controlled, how they allocated labor and materials. But from the Acropolis of Athens, no such archive has been found. No tablets have emerged from excavations on the rock or in the surrounding area that can definitively be attributed to a Bronze Age administrative centre. This absence is conspicuous, puzzling, and deeply consequential for our understanding. Does it mean that Athens, unlike Pylos or Mycenae, lacked the administrative apparatus that produced such records? That scribes did not work here, tallying and recording in the meticulous detail evident at other sites? Or does it simply mean that the tablets, if they existed, have not survived, or have not yet been discovered, destroyed by subsequent building activity, eroded by time, lost beneath layers of later construction that have never been fully excavated? The question matters because it shapes fundamentally how we can speak about this place. At Pylos, we know from the tablets that certain quantities of bronze were distributed to specific smiths, that particular religious festivals required precise offerings, that the palace controlled vast flocks of sheep assigned to named shepherds in documented locations. We know these things not through inference or analogy, but through direct documentary evidence. At Athens, we have none of this certainty. Everything we say about administration, economy, social organization must be reconstructed by analogy, by assuming that Athens, because it possessed cyclopean fortifications typical of Mycenaean citadels, must have shared other characteristics of the Mycenaean palatial system. But analogy is not proof. Similarity is not identity. The absence of tablets may indicate real differences in how Bronze Age Athens functioned compared to the better documented centres. Perhaps the administrative system here was less centralised, less bureaucratically elaborate. Perhaps record-keeping, if it existed, took different forms, marks on perishable materials like wood or leather that have vanished entirely, systems of memory and oral tradition that left no physical trace. Perhaps Athens occupied a middle position in the hierarchy of Mycenaean centres, significant enough to warrant massive fortifications, but not large or complex enough to develop the full administrative machinery typical of places like Pylos. Or perhaps, and this is equally possible, the tablets existed but were destroyed so completely that we will never recover them, their clay dissolved back into soil, their information lost forever. This uncertainty is, in its way, liberating. It forces us to acknowledge the limits of our knowledge, to recognise that history at this distance is always partial, fragmentary, provisional. We cannot know with certainty what daily life was like on the Bronze Age Acropolis. We cannot name the rulers who held power here, cannot read their edicts or their letters, cannot eavesdrop on their deliberations. We are like investigators arriving at a scene long after the principals have departed, trying to reconstruct what happened from the objects left behind: pottery shards, foundations of walls, scattered stones, each clue valuable but none sufficient to resolve all questions. Yet this very absence creates space for imagination disciplined by evidence. We can stand in the middle ground between pure speculation and documentary certainty, using what we know from comparable sites to sketch plausible reconstructions, while remaining honest about what cannot be verified. We can say that Mycenaean Athens likely participated in the broader cultural and economic patterns of the Bronze Age Aegean, trade networks, artistic styles, architectural forms, social hierarchies, without claiming to know the specific details of how these patterns manifested here. We can describe probable features of daily life, agricultural rhythms, craft production, religious observances, while acknowledging that the particulars are lost to us. There is something deeply human in this predicament. We live with partial knowledge all the time, filling in gaps with reasonable inference, constructing narratives from incomplete information, accepting that certainty is often unattainable. The historian working with fragmentary evidence practices a discipline that mirrors the human condition itself, the need to make sense of limited data, to distinguish between what can be known and what must remain uncertain, to resist the temptation to speak with false confidence about matters beyond the reach of available proof. The silence of the tablets, if indeed they never existed or have been irrecoverably lost, reminds us that most human experience leaves no trace. For every action documented, 1,000 remain unrecorded. For every name preserved, countless others vanish. The palace on the Acropolis once hummed with life, voices in conversation, footsteps on stone, the clatter of work and ceremony, and all of it has faded into silence, leaving only these stones, these walls, these fragments that hint at vanished complexity. We do the best we can with what survives, knowing that our reconstructions are provisional, incomplete, subject to revision as new evidence emerges or new interpretive frameworks develop. In accepting this uncertainty, we honour the past more truly than we would by pretending to knowledge we do not possess. Bronze Age Athens remains in many ways mysterious. Its people left no written testimony about their thoughts, their fears, their aspirations. They built in stone and bronze and clay, and most of what they built has crumbled. But the attempt to understand them, to imagine their world with care and discipline, to acknowledge both what we can infer and what remains forever beyond our reach, this is a worthy endeavour, an act of remembrance that connects us across the vast distance of centuries to lives once lived, now lost, dimly glimpsed through the fragmentary evidence they left behind. Nothing lasts forever. This is perhaps the most difficult truth for any civilization to accept, particularly one at its height, confident in its power, secure behind its walls, certain that the systems and structures that have sustained it will continue indefinitely. Yet across the eastern Mediterranean during the 13th and 12th centuries before the Common Era, the elaborate network of Bronze Age societies that had flourished for centuries began to unravel. The process was neither sudden nor uniform, not a single catastrophic event, but rather a cascading series of disruptions, each amplifying the others until the entire system reached a critical point beyond which it could not sustain itself. Palace centres that had stood for generations were destroyed or abandoned. Trade routes that had connected distant regions contracted or collapsed entirely. Writing systems fell out of use. Population levels declined dramatically. The archaeological record shows unmistakable signs of widespread disruption, though the causes remain debated and almost certainly varied from place to place. Athens, on its fortified rock, would not have been immune to these broader currents. The citadel existed not in isolation, but as part of an interconnected world. When trade networks weakened, when the flow of tin necessary for bronze production became uncertain, when coastal communities faced increased raiding and piracy, when climatic shifts may have affected agricultural productivity across wide regions, all these pressures would have been felt here as elsewhere. A citadel that depended on imported metals for tools and weapons, that participated in exchange networks bringing prestige goods and specialist knowledge, that drew tribute from a countryside already operating at the margins of sustainability. Such a place was vulnerable in ways that might not have been immediately apparent during times of prosperity, but became critical when conditions deteriorated. The archaeological evidence from Athens itself suggests declining vitality in the period after the height of Mycenaean civilization. The palatial structures on the Acropolis, whatever their exact form, seem to have been abandoned or destroyed. Later construction has obliterated most traces, making precise dating difficult, but the general pattern is clear. The elaborate fortified centre that characterized the Late Bronze Age did not continue into the subsequent period. Pottery styles change in ways that suggest reduced contact with other regions, less standardization, possibly declining specialist production, and increasing reliance on local, simpler forms. Burial practices show changes that might indicate social disruption, the breakdown of established hierarchies and customs. But we must be careful not to over-dramatize this process or to imagine it as apocalyptic catastrophe. The walls did not suddenly crumble. The population did not vanish overnight. What seems to have happened, based on evidence from Athens and comparable sites, was a gradual reduction in complexity, a slow, winding down of the elaborate systems that had characterized palatial society. Perhaps the ruler died without a strong successor, and competing factions could not resolve their disputes peacefully. Perhaps repeated poor harvests exhausted stored reserves and undermined confidence in the palace's ability to provide security. Perhaps external threats, raiders from the sea, pressure from displaced populations moving southward, made the citadel's position increasingly untenable. Or perhaps, most likely, it was some combination of factors, each feeding the others in a negative spiral from which recovery became impossible. Imagine living through such a time, not knowing that you stand at the threshold of a dark age, unaware that the structures your grandparents took for granted will not survive your own lifetime. The changes would have been subtle at first, easy to dismiss as temporary difficulties. One year the ships that usually brought tin from distant sources do not arrive, and the bronze smiths make do with recycled metal, melting down old tools to forge new ones. The quality suffers slightly, but life continues. The next year, or perhaps several years later, tribute from outlying villages is less than expected. The headmen pleading crop failure, excessive rains or not enough, problems with livestock disease. The palace storerooms are still adequate, reserves drawn down but not exhausted. Then repairs to the fortifications are delayed because skilled masons have left for other places, or died without training successors, or simply cannot be spared from agricultural work that now requires every available hand. The palace retinue shrinks as the ruler can no longer afford to support as many retainers, craftsmen, guards. Specialists leave, seeking better prospects elsewhere or returning to farming to ensure their families have enough to eat. Trade goods become scarce luxuries rather than regular features of elite life. The administrative machinery, if it ever existed in elaborate form at Athens, breaks down, fewer officials, less coordination between centre and periphery, growing autonomy of village communities who can no longer rely on the citadel for protection or redistribution and must fend for themselves. Religious observances continue, but perhaps with diminished confidence, as prayers go unanswered, as the connection between divine favour and earthly prosperity seems to weaken, as the old certainties about how the world works begin to seem questionable. Eventually, perhaps after decades of such slow erosion, the citadel is no longer sustainable as a political and economic centre. The population remaining there is too small, too impoverished, too isolated. People drift away, back to family holdings in the countryside, to other regions less affected by decline, to lives that do not depend on the failing system centered on the rock. The palace, if it has not already been destroyed by fire or conflict, is abandoned, its timbers scavenged for fuel or building materials, its bronze fittings melted down, its storage jars broken or carried off, its rooms left empty to the wind and rain. This is not the end of human habitation on the Acropolis or in Attica more broadly, but it marks the end of a particular form of social organisation, a particular way of life. The Bronze Age citadel, with its massive fortifications and palatial structures, its hierarchies and redistributive economy, its participation in the wider Mycenaean world, all this fades, not in a single dramatic collapse, but through a protracted process of diminishment, until what remains is so reduced, so altered, that calling it the same society becomes difficult to justify. What follows is not annihilation but transformation, a long twilight period during which much knowledge is lost, many skills forgotten, the material basis of civilization simplified dramatically, as Attica, along with much of the Greek world, enters a dark age from which it will eventually emerge transformed. The archaeological investigation of Bronze Age Athens confronts a fundamental challenge that shapes everything we can say about this lost city. Unlike sites such as Pompeii, frozen in time by volcanic ash, or desert settlements preserved by extreme aridity, the Acropolis has been continuously occupied and rebuilt for more than 3,000 years. Every subsequent generation has left its mark, constructing new buildings on the ruins of old, quarrying stone from earlier structures, levelling and filling and reshaping the rock's surface to suit contemporary needs. The classical Greeks built their magnificent temples here, partially demolishing or incorporating whatever Bronze Age remains still stood. The Romans added their own structures. Byzantine Christians converted pagan temples into churches. Ottoman Turks fortified the hill and built mosques. Modern archaeologists work within this palimpsest, trying to separate layers to understand which stones belong to which period, to reconstruct vanished buildings from fragmentary foundations and scattered debris. The remains that can be definitively attributed to the Bronze Age are sparse, tantalizingly incomplete. Beneath the Erechtheion, one of the great temples of classical Athens, excavators have found column bases cut into the bedrock, suggesting that wooden columns once stood here, supporting some structure whose full plan cannot be recovered. A few courses of wall foundations, their stones massive and roughly dressed in a style consistent with Mycenaean construction, hint at buildings whose upper stories and roofs have vanished entirely. Sections of stairway carved into the living rock lead nowhere now, their destinations obliterated by later building activity. Pottery sherds scattered through various excavation levels include fragments characteristic of late Bronze Age styles, confirming occupation during the relevant period, but telling us little about the specifics of daily life. From these fragments, archaeologists construct hypotheses, carefully qualified and provisional. Perhaps this column base was part of a Megaron-style hall, the great room typical of Mycenaean palaces. Perhaps these wall foundations enclosed a courtyard, or mark the boundary of a sacred precinct. Perhaps this stairway provided access to an upper terrace, or descended toward water sources on the northern slope. The language of archaeological interpretation is necessarily tentative, hedged with uncertainty, acknowledging that alternative explanations may be equally plausible. This caution is not weakness, but intellectual honesty, a recognition that the evidence is insufficient for definitive conclusions, that imagination must be disciplined by what can actually be demonstrated rather than what we might wish to claim. The fragmentary nature of the evidence means that even basic questions remain unresolved. How large was the Bronze Age palace? What was its internal organisation? How many rooms? Serving what functions? Arranged in what configuration? Were there multiple structures within the fortifications, or a single complex? How many people lived permanently on the rock? Dozens? Hundreds? What percentage of Attica's population resided in the citadel versus the surrounding countryside? All these questions, which we could answer with confidence for better preserved sites, remain matters of informed speculation for Athens. Yet the very silence of the stones carries meaning. The fact that so little survives tells us something important about the processes that have shaped this place over millennia, It speaks to the violence that later construction does to earlier remains, how each generation's building projects necessarily destroy or obscure what came before. When the classical Athenians quarried stone for their temples, they may well have dismantled Bronze Age walls not from malice or deliberate erasure of the past, but simply because worked stone was valuable and the ancient fortifications served no function in their contemporary world. When they dug foundation trenches for new buildings, they cut through earlier occupation layers, mixing and disturbing the stratigraphy that archaeologists rely on to establish chronology. When they levelled areas to create level platforms for construction, they removed or redeposited soil containing artifacts and structural remains from previous eras. This process of transformation, reuse, and gradual erasure is not unique to Athens. It characterises most long-occupied sites where human activity has continued across centuries or millennia. The archaeologists excavating beneath medieval London find Roman walls repurposed and Saxon structures built into Roman foundations. At Troy, famously, Heinrich Schliemann dug through the layers he sought, destroying later periods in his quest to reach what he believed was the Homeric city. The Acropolis presents a particularly extreme case because of its continuous importance, its limited area, and the ambition of successive building programs that required substantial modification of the terrain. But the underlying dynamic, the way later activity obscures or destroys earlier remains, is universal in urban archaeology. What we're left with, then, is not a complete picture, but a puzzle with most pieces missing, some damaged beyond recognition, others suggestive but ambiguous. The skill of the archaeologist lies in making sense of these fragments, in seeing patterns where others might see only confusion, in knowing which inferences are well supported and which are speculative. It requires not only technical knowledge, understanding pottery chronologies, architectural styles, construction techniques, but also imagination tempered by skepticism, the ability to envision what might have been while remaining honest about the limits of available proof. There is something humbling and strangely comforting in this acknowledgement of ignorance. It reminds us that the past does not come to us whole and complete, neatly packaged for consumption, but must be painstakingly reconstructed from whatever traces happen to survive. It teaches us to value negative evidence, to recognise that absence of proof is not proof of absence, that gaps in the record may reflect accidents of preservation or the violence of subsequent history, rather than the original absence of the thing we seek. And it encourages appropriate modesty about our knowledge, an awareness that future discoveries might overturn present interpretations, that what seems certain now may appear doubtful later as new evidence emerges or new analytical techniques become available. The collapse that overtook Bronze Age Athens did not occur in isolation, but formed part of a much wider pattern of disruption that swept across the eastern Mediterranean world during the decades around 1200 years before the Common Era. The great palatial centres of the Mycenaean civilization, which had dominated mainland Greece for centuries, fell into decline or were violently destroyed within a remarkably short span of time. Mycenae itself, the citadel that gave its name to an entire civilization, shows evidence of destruction by fire. Tiryns, with its massive fortifications and elaborate palace, was abandoned or severely reduced in scale. Pylos on the western coast, whose Linear B tablets preserve such detailed administrative records, burned in a conflagration that baked the clay tablets hard and preserved them for modern discovery, but the palace was never rebuilt and the site lost its significance. This was not merely a matter of individual centres suffering individual misfortunes. The pattern was too widespread, too synchronous, across too large a region to be explained by local causes alone. Something systemic was failing. The networks of exchange that had connected these centres to one another and to the wider Mediterranean world contracted or collapsed. Trade goods that had once moved regularly across the sea, metals, pottery, luxury items, perhaps grain during times of scarcity became scarce or unavailable. The administrative systems documented in the Linear B tablets with their meticulous tracking of resources and labour ceased to function. The script itself fell out of use, not to be revived until the classical period when the Greeks adapted the Phoenician alphabet to their language. Knowledge that had been cultivated and transmitted within palatial contexts, literacy, certain craft techniques, perhaps traditions of monumental architecture, was lost or drastically reduced. Scholars have proposed numerous explanations for this widespread collapse, and it is likely that multiple factors converge to create a crisis beyond any single cause. Climate change may have played a role, with evidence suggesting drought conditions in some regions affecting agricultural productivity and straining the capacity of palatial centres to feed their populations and maintain their retinues. Seaborne raiders, remembered in Egyptian texts as the Sea Peoples, attacked coastal cities and disrupted maritime trade routes, creating insecurity that further weakened economic exchange. Internal social tensions may have reached breaking points in societies, characterized by steep hierarchies and rigid social stratification, leading to revolts or political fragmentation. Epidemics, though difficult to detect in the archaeological record, could have devastated populations. Most likely these factors interacted in cascading failures, drought leading to food shortages, which prompted migration and conflict, which disrupted trade networks, which weakened palatial economies, which undermined the capacity to respond to subsequent challenges, and so on in a downward spiral. For Athens, positioned on its fortified rock, the implications would have been profound even if the citadel itself was not violently destroyed. The evidence suggests something more subtle and perhaps more devastating than a single catastrophic event, a gradual erosion of the systems that sustained the Bronze Age citadel, a slow winding down until the structure could no longer maintain itself. The palace, if it had not already burned or been deliberately demolished, was abandoned, its functions ceasing, its population dispersing. The massive fortifications, which had required such enormous labour to construct, and which must have seemed permanent and impregnable, no longer served any purpose once there was no centralised authority to defend, no concentrated population to protect, no administrative apparatus to justify their maintenance. Imagine the Acropolis not at its height, but in these twilight years of decline. The walls still stand, weathered but solid, monuments to a power that no longer exists. The palace buildings are deteriorating, their wooden roofs sagging, their timbers rotting, their once plastered walls crumbling. Perhaps a few families still live on the rock, squatters in spaces designed for very different purposes, maintaining small gardens in what were once formal courtyards, keeping goats where warriors once assembled. Or perhaps the citadel has been completely abandoned, left to wind and rain, to wild plants taking root in cracks between stones, to birds nesting in empty rooms, to the slow work of entropy reducing human ambition back to the raw material of stone and earth. The countryside around the citadel, which once looked to it for protection and organisation, must adapt to new realities. Without the palace as a centre of redistribution, villages become more self-sufficient, or simply fail when local conditions prove unfavourable. Without the organised military force that the citadel could mobilise, each community must provide for its own defence, leading perhaps to smaller-scale fortifications, to alliances between neighbouring villages, to a more fragmented and localised pattern of security. Trade continues, but on a reduced scale, more regional than interregional, more dependent on direct exchange between producers and consumers than on palatial intermediation. Population levels almost certainly declined, whether through death, emigration, or reduced fertility in stressed conditions. The pottery record from post-palatial Greece suggests simpler forms, less standardisation, fewer specialist potters, more household production of basic vessels. Bronze becomes scarce, and stone tools, which had been supplemental during the prosperous Bronze Age, return to greater prominence. Skills requiring long training and institutional support, monumental architecture, fine metalwork, literacy, are lost or drastically reduced. Social hierarchies flatten, not because some egalitarian ideal triumphed, but because the economic surplus required to support elaborate hierarchies no longer exists. This period following the collapse of the palatial system, which scholars call the Greek Dark Age, lasted for generations, 200, 300, perhaps 400 years, depending on how one defines its beginning and end. It was dark not because people ceased to exist or because life became uniformly miserable, but because the material record becomes much sparser, because complexity was reduced, because the documentary sources that allow us to know earlier and later periods with some precision simply do not exist for these centuries. Archaeological sites show continued habitation, but reduced wealth and organisation. Burials are simpler, with fewer grave goods. Settlements are smaller and more dispersed. The grand projects of the Bronze Age, the massive fortifications, the elaborate palaces, the far-reaching trade networks, belonged to a vanished world, remembered perhaps in oral tradition, gradually mythologized, but no longer part of lived reality. For those who lived through this transformation, who witnessed the slow decline of institutions their grandparents had taken for granted, the experience must have been profoundly disorienting, though perhaps not as dramatically terrible as the phrase "a collapse" might suggest to modern ears. Between the end of the palatial civilization and the emergence of what we call archaic Greece lies a period so poorly documented, so lacking in the kinds of evidence that allow historians to reconstruct societies with confidence, that scholars have traditionally called it the Greek Dark Age. The term is not entirely fair, for it reflects our ignorance more than any absolute darkness in the lives of those who lived through these centuries. People continued to inhabit the landscape, to farm and raise children, to make pottery and tools, to worship their gods and bury their dead. But the material record they left behind is sparse, the settlements smaller and simpler, the evidence of organised political authority minimal or absent. And perhaps most significantly, the practice of writing disappeared entirely from the Greek mainland, not to return for several centuries. Without written records to anchor chronology or document events, we are left with archaeology alone, and archaeology at this reduced scale can tell us little beyond bare survival. For generations following the collapse of the palatial system, the people of Attica lived in a world radically diminished from what their great-grandparents had known. The massive fortifications on the Acropolis, if they still stood at all, served no function in a society that no longer concentrated wealth or population in defensible centres. The stones became a quarry, a source of building material for anyone who needed it and had the means to move such heavy blocks. A family building a farmstead might drag smaller stones down from the abandoned citadel, incorporating Bronze Age masonry into walls meant for simpler purposes, animal pens, storage structures, the foundations of modest dwellings. The great Cyclopean walls designed to withstand assault were slowly cannibalized, their stones repurposed for needs their original builders could never have imagined. On the rock itself, if anyone lived there at all during the darkest centuries, it was not as part of any organized community or administrative center, but as individuals or small family groups occupying spaces that had once served very different functions. Perhaps a shepherd built a simple hut using fallen timbers from the collapsed palace, keeping his flock nearby, using the old fortification walls as ready-made enclosures. Perhaps squatters dwelt in whatever structures remained partially intact, maintaining small fires in rooms where palatial feasts had once been held, drawing water from cisterns whose original engineering they no longer understood. Or perhaps the hilltop was completely abandoned for generations, left to weather and vegetation, to the gradual work of entropy reducing human constructions back toward the state of raw nature from which they had been raised. The loss of literacy during this period represents one of the most striking discontinuities in Greek history. Linear B, the script used to record administrative documents during the palatial era, fell out of use completely when the palace bureaucracies that employed it ceased to exist. Without institutions to maintain specialized knowledge, without scribes training apprentices in the complex syllabary, the skill simply vanished. For centuries, no one in Greece could read or write. All information had to be transmitted orally, through memory and repetition, through stories told and retold around fires, through traditions passed from parent to child. Some knowledge survived this transmission, stories that would eventually be shaped into the epics attributed to Homer, genealogies of important families, perhaps fragments of technical knowledge about agriculture or craft work. But much was lost or transformed beyond recognition, simplified and mythologized through repeated telling until the original facts, if they had ever been facts, became impossible to recover. Imagine living 5 or 6 generations after the end of the palatial world, perhaps around 1100 or 1000 years before the Common Era. You are a farmer in Attica, your family holding a small plot of land that your great-great-grandfather cleared and cultivated. You know nothing of Mycenaean civilization except perhaps dimly, through stories so ancient and worn that their connection to historical reality has faded almost completely. Perhaps your grandfather told you that the massive stones scattered on the hill above were placed there by giants, or by gods, or by heroes of an age when men were stronger and the world was different. Perhaps he said that kings once ruled from that height, but the word king means little to you beyond a figure in stories, someone from a time so distant as to be essentially mythical. Your life is bounded by immediate concerns, the weather, the harvest. relations with neighbouring families, the health of your animals, the maintenance of your tools and dwelling. You live in a house of mud, brick and thatch, simpler than the structures your Bronze Age predecessors built, but adequate for your needs. Your pottery is handmade or turned on a simple wheel, functional but less refined than the standardized wares of the earlier centuries. Your tools are mostly stone with a few precious bronze implements carefully maintained because replacement is difficult. You trade with neighbours for things you cannot produce yourself, but the networks of exchange are local, extending perhaps to adjacent valleys but not much farther. The old certainties are gone. The palace that once demanded tribute and provided protection no longer exists. The administrative system that tracked and redistributed resources has vanished. The gods may still be worshipped, but the elaborate rituals conducted under palatial auspices, whatever they were, are no longer performed. Religion continues in simpler forms, household shrines, offerings at natural features like springs or caves, seasonal, celebrations marking planting and harvest. Authority, such as it exists, is local and personal. The village headman, the patriarch of an extended family, agreements reached through custom and negotiation rather than imposed from above by an administrative apparatus. This is not an age of great achievements or grand monuments. Nothing is being built that will survive 3,000 years to be excavated and admired. The material footprint is light, almost invisible, but life continues, generation after generation, in rhythms as old as agriculture itself. Children are born and grow and have children of their own. Knowledge of practical skills, when to plant, how to manage flocks, where to find clay for pottery, how to maintain tools, passes reliably from one generation to the next. The social fabric, though simpler than in palatial times, holds communities together. People find meaning in family, in work, in the seasonal cycles, in whatever religious beliefs sustain them through hard times. Slowly, across generations so numerous that no single lifetime could have perceived the change, conditions began to shift again. The Greek Dark Age did not end suddenly with some dramatic event or innovation, but rather faded gradually as population levels stabilized and then began to grow, as trade contacts were cautiously re-established, as certain communities began to accumulate enough surplus to support specialists and more complex social organization. By the 8th century before the Common Era, and certainly by the 7th, signs of renewal appear in the archaeological record across the Greek world. Settlements become more substantial. Pottery styles show increasing sophistication and standardization. Most significantly, the Greeks encountered and adapted the Phoenician alphabet, creating a writing system far simpler and more flexible than Linear B, one that could record not just administrative tallies but poetry, laws, personal names, dedications to the gods, the full range of human expression. Athens participated in this revival, though the evidence suggests it may have been somewhat slower to recover than some other regions. The Acropolis, that ancient rock that had supported a Bronze Age citadel and then stood abandoned or minimally occupied for centuries, began once more to attract human attention and investment. But the Athens that emerged from the dark centuries was profoundly different from its Bronze Age predecessor. This was no longer a palatial centre with a ruler commanding tribute from surrounding territories, maintaining a retinue of specialists and warriors, redistributing resources through an administrative bureaucracy. Instead, archaic Athens was evolving towards something new, a community of citizens, limited at first to a narrow elite of landowners to be sure but recognisably different from the hierarchical palatial societies of the Bronze Age. The Acropolis itself was reclaimed not as a residential palace or administrative centre, but primarily as a sacred space. Small temples began to appear on the rock, modest structures by later standards, but significant as markers of renewed communal investment and religious focus. These early temples, built during the 7th and 6th centuries before the Common Era, were dedicated to Athena, the goddess who would become so central to Athenian identity. They were built of wood and mud brick initially, later replaced by more durable stone structures, each generation's temple superseding and incorporating elements of what came before. Archaeological evidence for these early shrines is fragmentary, disturbed by the massive building programs of the classical period that would eventually transform the Acropolis into the monument we recognize today. But enough survives to indicate that by the Archaic period, the hill had become primarily a religious centre, a place where the community gathered for festivals and sacrifices, where dedications were made and stored, where the boundaries between human and divine were ritually maintained. The relationship between this emerging archaic Athens and the Bronze Age past that lay buried beneath its feet is complex and uncertain. Did the people of the 8th or 7th century know that massive fortifications from an earlier age lay concealed beneath their shrines? Did they understand that the large worked stones they occasionally encountered were remnants of a sophisticated civilization that had flourished and then vanished? The evidence suggests that some memory persisted, though how accurate or how mythologized is impossible to determine. Later, Greek tradition spoke of Athens as having been continuously inhabited since time immemorial, never conquered by the Dorians whose migrations were said to have transformed much of the Greek world after the Bronze Age collapse. Some scholars see in this tradition a kernel of truth, a reflection of genuine continuity of population even through the dark centuries. Others view it as myth-making, an attempt by classical Athenians to claim special status through assertion of unbroken lineage extending back to heroic times. What seems certain is that whatever memories of the Bronze Age citadel survived were deeply transformed, filtered through generations of oral transmission, mixed with myth and legend until separating fact from fiction became impossible for the Greeks themselves, let alone for us looking back across millennia. The massive Cyclopean walls, whose stones still stood in places during the Archaic period, may have been attributed to the work of legendary heroes or demigods. The ancient palace, long vanished above ground but perhaps hinted at by foundations and scattered stones, may have been connected to mythical kings whose names appear in Homer, Theseus, Erechtheus, figures whose historical reality is doubtful but whose cultural significance was profound. The Greeks of the Archaic period, beginning to create their own monumental architecture and dedicate impressive votive offerings, saw themselves not as innovators but as heirs to a glorious past, rebuilding and reviving traditions they believed had always been theirs. In practical terms, the reuse of the hilltop meant transformation of its physical fabric. Wherever archaic builders wanted a level ground for a temple or a terrace, they necessarily disturbed or removed whatever Bronze Age remains still existed at that level. When they needed foundation stones, they might quarry them from visible remnants of earlier walls. When they dug pits for dedicatory offerings or for building foundations, they cut through occupation layers from previous eras, mixing and disturbing the stratigraphic record. The process was not deliberate destruction of the past, but simply the inevitable consequence of the present making use of limited space for its own purposes. Every generation reshapes the landscape it inherits, and in doing so, obscures or erases traces of what came before. The social and political organisation of archaic Athens was evolving in directions that would eventually lead to classical democracy, though that development lay generations in the future and would have seemed unimaginable to those living through the earlier phases. What mattered in the 8th and 7th centuries was the gradual consolidation of a political community, the emergence of shared identity among people living in Attica who came to see themselves as Athenians, distinct from their neighbours in Megara or Boeotia or Corinth. This identity was reinforced through religious observances centred on the Acropolis, through participation in festivals and rituals that defined who belonged to the community and who did not, through the slow development of civic institutions that could resolve disputes and coordinate collective action without requiring a king or palace bureaucracy. The city itself, the urban centre that would eventually surround and extend beyond the Acropolis, was still modest. Most people in Attica lived in the countryside, farming small plots, raising animals, producing the agricultural surplus that would support increasing specialization and urbanization. But Athens as a place, as a name, as an identity, was emerging from the centuries of darkness, finding new forms of organization and expression that owed little to the palatial systems of the Bronze Age, even as they unfolded on the same sacred rock. By the time the classical Athenians of the 5th century before the Common Era walked the Acropolis, constructing their magnificent temples of marble and celebrating their democratic institutions and cultural achievements, the Bronze Age citadel that had once crowned this same rock had been buried beneath centuries of accumulated history, its memory so thoroughly transformed by myth and legend that the actual facts of its existence had become essentially irrecoverable. The classical Athenians knew, of course, that their city was ancient. They told stories of legendary kings and heroes who had ruled from the Acropolis in times so distant as to be essentially mythical. Cecrops, the first king, depicted as half man and half serpent, who supposedly founded the city in primordial times. Erechtheus, after whom the great Erechtheian temple was named. Theseus, the hero king who united Attica into a single political entity and who symbolized Athenian claims to autochthony, to having sprung from the very soil of their land rather than arriving as conquerors or colonists. But these stories, however deeply believed and culturally significant, bore little relationship to the actual Bronze Age polity that had existed on the Acropolis more than 1,000 years before the classical period. The transformation of memory across such vast temporal distance, particularly when that distance includes centuries without literacy, produces narratives that may preserve fragments of truth embedded in elaborate frameworks of fantasy. Perhaps the name Erechtheus derives from a Bronze Age ruler whose actual deeds are lost but whose name survived in oral tradition long enough to be attached to a legendary figure. Perhaps stories of Theseus unifying Attica reflect dim memories of the process by which a Bronze Age citadel extended its control over surrounding territories. Or perhaps these legendary figures have no historical foundation whatsoever, being instead the pure creations of mythopoeic imagination, attempts by later Greeks to explain origins, to account for why things were as they were, to provide their political institutions and religious practices with the legitimacy that comes from great antiquity. What matters for our purposes is not whether these legends contain historical truth, but rather that they demonstrate how thoroughly the actual Bronze Age past had been forgotten by classical times. The Athenians of Pericles' day, walking through the Acropolis where construction of the Parthenon was transforming the sacred precinct into the architectural wonder we still admire, had no conception that beneath their feet lay the fragmentary remains of Cyclopean fortifications, of a Megaron palace, of water cisterns and storage chambers, from a civilization that would have seemed utterly foreign to them had they somehow been able to observe it directly. They believed themselves the heirs of an unbroken tradition stretching back to mythical times, but the actual continuity was far more complex, marked by profound disruptions and transformations that had erased or fundamentally altered nearly everything from the earlier age. This historical amnesia is not surprising or unusual. Human memory, both individual and collective, is remarkably selective and unreliable over long periods. Without written records to anchor historical facts, without institutional mechanisms for preserving accurate information across generations, oral tradition inevitably transforms, simplifies, and mythologizes the past. Stories are shaped by the needs and understanding of those who tell them. Details that seem irrelevant or incomprehensible are dropped. Elements from different periods are combined. Supernatural explanations fill gaps in understanding. The result, after centuries of transmission, bears only the most tenuous connection to original events, if indeed there were specific original events rather than gradual processes that cannot be captured in narrative form at all. The physical transformation of the Acropolis contributed to this forgetting. Each major building program required levelling and filling, disturbing or removing whatever lay beneath. When classical Athenians decided to build the Parthenon in the mid-5th century, the project required a massive platform, levelled and extended beyond the natural contours of the rock. Earlier structures on the site, including an older temple destroyed by the Persians in 480 before the Common Era, had to be dismantled or buried. The fill used to create the platform included architectural fragments, sculptures, offerings that had been damaged in the Persian destruction, all deliberately buried in what modern archaeologists call the Perser chute, the Persian debris. This layer of fill, several metres thick in places, both preserved these 5th century objects and further buried whatever Bronze Age remains lay beneath. The sacred geography itself was reinterpreted across the centuries. Locations that may have had significance in Bronze Age religious practice, natural caves, springs, rock formations, were incorporated into classical cult practices, but with new meanings, new stories, new divine associations. The northern slope of the Acropolis, where caves and water sources suggested ancient sanctity, became associated with various mythical figures and events. The cave where Aglaros, daughter of the legendary king Cecrops, supposedly threw herself from the cliff, the sanctuary of Aphrodite and Eros, the place where Athenian ephebes took their oath of military service. Whether any of these associations had Bronze Age precedents, or whether they were entirely later inventions, is impossible to determine. The landscape accumulated meanings like sediment, each layer partially obscuring what lay beneath, while incorporating fragments of earlier tradition into new configurations. For the ordinary citizen of classical Athens, none of this mattered in any practical sense. The Bronze Age citadel was not a subject of historical inquiry, but at most a source of legends that reinforced civic identity and religious belief. The massive old stones occasionally encountered during construction were artifacts of a mythical age when heroes and gods walked the earth, not evidence of a historically real but fundamentally different civilization. The distinction between myth and history, which seems so important to modern consciousness, was not sharply drawn in ancient Greek thought. The past, especially the distant past, existed in a zone where human and divine and actions intermingled, where plausibility was less important than cultural meaning, where the symbolic truth of a story mattered more than its factual accuracy. This comfortable relationship with a mythologized past was sustainable precisely because the actual past was so thoroughly hidden, so completely inaccessible to investigation. Only in the modern period, with the development of scientific archaeology and the excavation of sites like Mycenae and Pylos, with the decipherment of Linear B and the application of systematic methods for dating and analyzing material remains, has it become possible to pierce through the veil of mythology and begin to reconstruct what Bronze Age Greece, including Bronze Age Athens, was actually like. And even now, as we have seen, the evidence is fragmentary, the reconstructions provisional, the uncertainties profound. Stand, if you will, on the Acropolis today, among the marble columns of the Parthenon, beneath the blue Mediterranean sky, surrounded by tourists and guides and the apparatus of modern heritage preservation. The site is magnificent, justly famous, one of humanity's great architectural achievements. The temple rises before you in pale stone, its proportions refined through subtle, mathematical adjustments that make straight lines appear curved, vertical columns seem perfectly upright, though they lean slightly inward, the whole structure achieving a harmony that speaks across millennia to something fundamental in human aesthetic sense. This is classical Athens at its apex, democracy and philosophy and tragic drama all finding expression in stone, the visible manifestation of a culture that would shape Western civilization for thousands of years to come. But beneath your feet, invisible and largely forgotten except by specialists, lies another city, another civilization, another way of organizing human society and understanding the world. The Bronze Age citadel that once stood here, with its massive cyclopean walls and its Megaron palace, its water cisterns and storage chambers, its hierarchical social structure and palatial economy, all of this has been buried by time and by the accumulated building programs of later ages. Yet without that earlier foundation, without the Bronze Age decision to fortify this particular rock, to make it a centre of political authority and regional organisation, would classical Athens have risen here at all? The question is unanswerable but worth considering. Geography is not destiny, but it creates possibilities and constraints that shape human choices across generations. The Acropolis, by its nature as a steep-sided limestone outcrop rising abruptly from the plain, invited fortification. Bronze Age builders recognised this and acted accordingly, investing enormous labour in walls and structures that would establish this place as significant, as special, as different from the surrounding landscape. That act of establishment, even after the Bronze Age citadel itself had crumbled and been forgotten, left traces, physical traces in the stones themselves, but also something more intangible, a sense that this hill mattered, that it had always mattered, that it would continue to matter for whatever community called this place home. When archaic Greeks began to rebuild Athens from the ruins of the Dark Age, they naturally gravitated to the Acropolis as the sacred centre of their emerging community. The hill's defensive advantages no longer mattered in the same way. The city was expanding beyond any possibility of being contained within the old fortifications, but its symbolic importance, its position as a natural focal point visible from great distances, its accumulated associations with sacredness and authority, all made it the obvious location for temples and civic monuments. And those archaic temples, modest though they were compared to what would come later, established patterns that the classical builders would follow and magnify. The orientation towards certain compass directions, the allocation of space for different cult activities, the integration of natural features into sacred geography, all these decisions made in the archaic period built upon even earlier patterns, some of which might trace back, however indirectly, to Bronze Age practice. The great building program of the 5th century, which produced the Parthenon and the Propylaea, and the Erechtheion, and the other monuments that define the classical Acropolis, was made possible by the wealth and confidence of imperial Athens at its height, by the surplus extracted from the Delian League allies, by the political will of leaders like Pericles who saw monumental architecture as essential to civic identity and prestige. But it was also made possible by the existence of this hill, this particular configuration of stone and space, that had been recognized as significant for 1,000 years already, that had accumulated layers of meaning and use that made it the natural and inevitable location for Athens' greatest architectural expression. Think about the remarkable continuity this represents. From approximately 1,300 years before the Common Era, when Bronze Age builders were raising Cyclopean walls on this rock, to 432 before the Common Era when the Parthenon was completed, spans nearly 9 centuries, a temporal distance greater than that which separates us from medieval Europe. Through all those centuries, through the collapse of Bronze Age civilization, through the long Dark Age, through the slow emergence of archaic Greece and the rapid flowering of classical culture, this hill remained central to human activity in this place. Not continuously in the same way, not with unbroken institutional memory or practice, but with a persistence that speaks to something about how human beings interact with landscape, how places acquire meaning that transcends any particular generation or civilization. The irony, of course, is that classical Athenians who gloried in the Parthenon had no idea that their achievement rested quite literally on the buried remains of an earlier civilization that was in many ways as sophisticated and organized as their own. They thought themselves the heirs of legendary heroes but would have found the actual realities of Bronze Age palatial society, the centralized control, the administrative complexity documented in Linear B tablets, the redistributive economy, utterly foreign to their democratic ideals and civic culture. The foundation they built upon was hidden from them, its lessons lost, its warnings unheeded because unknown. What can we take from this? Perhaps simply an awareness that human history has depth beyond what any single generation can perceive, that the present always rests on layers of past that are mostly invisible, that what seems solid and permanent in our own time will itself become buried, transformed, forgotten, reinterpreted by whatever civilizations follow. The Bronze Age citadel endured for centuries and then vanished so completely that its memory was transmuted into myth. Classical Athens achieved heights of cultural brilliance that shaped human civilization for millennia, yet even its magnificent monuments are ruins now, preserved more by conscious choice and archaeological science than by any inherent permanence. What seems eternal proves temporary. What appears forgotten may leave subtle traces that influence futures those who created them could never imagine. Standing on the Acropolis, then, becomes an exercise in temporal perspective, an opportunity to feel the weight of accumulated history beneath the visible present. The marble columns are beautiful, but they are also relatively young, a mere 2,500 years old compared to the 3,500-year history of human activity on this rock. Beneath the classical foundations lie archaic remains. Beneath those, the scattered fragments of Bronze Age construction. Beneath everything, the limestone bedrock, shaped by geological processes that dwarf human timescales entirely. We are surrounded by layers, by accretions of meaning and memory and material culture, most of which remains hidden, knowable only through painstaking investigation and careful inference. The losses are almost total, nearly absolute. The Bronze Age palace that once crowned the Acropolis has vanished so completely that we cannot even reconstruct its floor plan with confidence, cannot say how many rooms it contained or how they were arranged, cannot know the colour of its painted walls or the songs sung in its great hall. The social structures that organised Bronze Age Athenian society, the hierarchies of power and obligation, the systems by which surplus was extracted from the countryside and redistributed to specialists, the relationships between ruler and ruled, between elite and commoner, between free and enslaved, all dissolved during the collapse and Dark Age, leaving no direct descendants in the very different social organisation of classical Athens. The water systems that Bronze Age engineers carved into rock, the cisterns and channels that made the citadel habitable, have been obliterated by later construction, or remain buried and unidentified, their sophisticated engineering forgotten for millennia. The everyday lives of Bronze Age Athenians, their hopes and fears, their beliefs about the cosmos and their place in it, Their relationships with family and neighbours, their pleasures and sorrows, are lost beyond any possibility of recovery. We can infer general patterns from analogies with better documented sites, can make educated guesses about daily rhythms and material culture, but the texture of actual lived experience, the specific personalities and individual stories, the accumulated wisdom and particular foolishness of real people who walked these stones, all of this has vanished as completely as if it never existed. The rituals they performed, whatever they were, ceased to be practiced. The gods or goddesses they worshipped, under whatever names, either disappeared entirely from later Greek religion, or were transformed so thoroughly that any continuity became unrecognizable. The crafts they mastered, the specific techniques for working bronze, for mixing plaster, for constructing roofs that would shed Mediterranean rains, were either lost during the Dark Age or survived only in changed forms that owed nothing to conscious transmission from Bronze Age masters. Yet to say that everything was lost would be an oversimplification, a failure to recognize the subtle ways in which past shapes future even when direct continuity is broken. The hill itself remained, its physical properties unchanged by human catastrophe. It was still a steep-sided rock rising from the plain, still offering defensive advantages to anyone who cared to fortify it, still providing a natural gathering place visible from throughout the surrounding region. These geographical facts constrained and enabled human choices across all subsequent periods. When archaic Greeks decided to build temples on the Acropolis, they were responding to the same features that had made it attractive to Bronze Age builders: the prominence, the natural defensibility, the way it dominated the landscape both practically and symbolically. Some patterns may have persisted at levels too deep or too diffuse to document definitively. The notion that this particular hill was special, sacred, worthy of investment and reverence, this idea, however transformed in its specifics, may trace back through the dark centuries to Bronze Age precedents. Perhaps oral traditions, degraded and mythologized beyond recognition, preserved some sense that the Acropolis had always been central to community identity. Perhaps the very stones, visible even after the palace had fallen, served as mnemonic devices, prompting stories about the past that, while factually wrong, maintained emotional truth about continuity and belonging. Perhaps certain places on or around the hill, specific caves, springs, rock formations, remained associated with sacredness across all periods, their significance predating even the Bronze Age, connecting classical Greeks to religious practices and beliefs that stretched back into the Neolithic past. The human instinct to fortify, to build, to gather in community, to create structures that outlast individual lifetimes, these are not culturally specific but appear across civilizations and eras. Bronze Age Athenians expressed these instincts through cyclopean walls and megaron palaces. Archaic Greeks expressed them through temples and dedications. Classical Athenians built the Parthenon. The specific forms changed, the meanings shifted, the social systems that made construction possible were radically different, yet underneath ran continuities of human ambition and creativity that connected these disparate cultures despite the ruptures of historical discontinuity. What we confront, then, in studying Bronze Age Athens is not simply a lost civilization, but a meditation on the nature of historical memory itself, on how cultures remember and forget, on the processes by which knowledge is transmitted or fails to transmit across generations. History, we discover, is not a smooth continuum, but rather a series of layers imperfectly connected, with gaps and discontinuities as significant as the continuities. The past does not flow seamlessly into the present, but rather erupts into it in fragmentary form, a scatter of pottery sherds, a line of foundation stones, myths whose relationship to fact is irretrievable, demanding interpretation that can never achieve certainty. This condition of uncertainty and loss is not unique to Bronze Age Athens, but characterizes most of human history. For every society that left abundant written records and well-preserved archaeological remains, dozens left almost nothing. For every voice preserved across millennia, thousands were silenced by death and time, their words and thoughts and experiences vanishing without echo. The people who lived on the Bronze Age Acropolis were no less human, no less complex in their inner lives, no less worthy of memory than the classical Athenians whose names we know and whose works we can read. But history is not fair in its preservation. It does not reward worthiness with remembrance. Survival depends on accidents of preservation, on the choices of later generations about what matters, on the development of technologies and methodologies that can interpret fragmentary evidence. In acknowledging what was lost, we honour the past more truthfully than by pretending to comprehensive knowledge. Bronze Age Athens remains mysterious not because ancient people deliberately obscured it, but because time and circumstance have erased most traces, because later activity disturbed or destroyed what might have survived, because the processes of cultural transmission across illiterate centuries transformed memory into myth. We can reconstruct some features through careful archaeology and comparative analysis. We can imagine others based on reasonable inference. But vast territories of Bronze Age Athenian experience remain forever beyond our reach, preserved only in the abstract awareness that people lived, struggled, achieved, failed, and finally disappeared, leaving behind these few stones as testament to their brief occupation of this hill between the mountains and the sea. What lessons, if any, can we draw from this story of Bronze Age Athens, from its rise and flourishing and eventual dissolution into a dark age from which a fundamentally different civilization eventually emerged? The temptation, always present when contemplating historical collapses, is to extract moral judgments, to identify fatal flaws, to construct narratives of hubris punished or wisdom ignored. But the honest answer may be more unsettling, that even well-organized societies with sophisticated infrastructure and elaborate systems for managing resources can fail, not necessarily because of particular errors or moral failings, but because human institutions are inherently fragile, vulnerable to stresses that exceed their adaptive capacity, subject to cascading failures that transform what seemed stable into what proves temporary. The Bronze Age citadel on the Acropolis appeared permanent to those who lived within its walls. The massive fortifications, requiring years of labour to construct, seemed as eternal as the rock itself. The administrative systems, if they existed, that coordinated tribute and redistribution must have felt like fixtures of reality, the way things had always been done and would continue forever. The social hierarchies that placed certain families at the apex and others at the base were naturalized through generations of repetition, justified by myth and ritual, accepted as the inevitable order of things. Yet all of it dissolved, not instantly, but across decades of slow erosion, until what had seemed permanent was revealed as contingent, dependent on conditions that could change, on systems that could fail, on assumptions about the world that could prove wrong. The collapse was not punishment for particular sins. Bronze Age Athenians were no more morally culpable than any other people making decisions with incomplete information under conditions of uncertainty. They could not have known that the wider Mycenaean world was approaching a systemic crisis, that the networks on which they depended were becoming unstable, that environmental or social or military pressures building elsewhere would eventually cascade into disruptions that would affect even relatively peripheral centres like Athens. They made reasonable choices given what they knew, invested in fortifications that made sense in a dangerous world, maintained hierarchies that were typical of their time, participated in exchange networks that brought benefits alongside vulnerabilities. Yet none of this prevented the slow unravelling that overtook their civilization, along with so many others during the catastrophic decades around 1200 years before the Common Era. This should give us pause about our own assumptions of permanence. The institutions we take for granted, political systems, economic arrangements, technological infrastructures, appear solid and inevitable from inside the societies that depend on them. We assume that essential services will continue, that supply chains will function, that the elaborate interdependencies of modern life will remain stable, because they always have within living memory. But living memory is short, and historical memory, as we have seen, is unreliable. Societies that seemed as permanent as any in human history have vanished or transformed so completely that their continuity with what came before is questionable. Nothing guarantees that our own civilization, for all its apparent sophistication and power, is immune to comparable disruptions. Yet the story of Bronze Age Athens offers reassurance alongside its warnings about fragility. Human beings survived the collapse of palatial civilization. They adapted to radically reduced circumstances, maintained communities across the dark centuries, transmitted enough cultural knowledge to enable eventual recovery and the emergence of new forms of social organization. Life continued even after the elaborate systems failed. People farmed and raised children, made pottery and told stories, found meaning and beauty in existence despite the loss of the grand structures their ancestors had known. The Dark Age was dark primarily in our inability to know much about it, not necessarily because it was uniformly terrible for those who lived through it. And from that darkness, eventually, new light emerged, the Archaic period, and ultimately the classical flowering that produced democracy, philosophy, tragic drama, the Parthenon. This resilience suggests something fundamental about human adaptability, about our capacity to rebuild after catastrophe, to create new forms when old ones fail. The classical Athenians who walked the Acropolis had no knowledge of the Bronze Age citadel beneath their feet, yet they were building on its foundation both literally and metaphorically. The geographical advantages that made the rock attractive to Bronze Age builders remained attractive to classical Greeks. The sense that this place mattered, that it was worthy of investment and reverence, persisted across the rupture of collapse. Human creativity and ambition, though expressed in radically different forms in Bronze Age versus classical civilization, connected these disparate cultures across the abyss of historical discontinuity. Perhaps the lesson, then, is one of humility tempered by confidence. Humility in recognizing that no human system is permanent, that what seems solid can dissolve, that we build on foundations we often cannot see or understand, that our own civilization rests on layers of history mostly invisible to us, that future generations may look back on our age with the same mixture of admiration and incomprehension that we direct toward the Bronze Age, but also confidence that human beings have survived catastrophic disruptions before and adapted, that resilience is as characteristic of our species as vulnerability, that cultures can be reborn even from ashes, that knowledge lost can be rediscovered or reinvented, that the creative impulse to build, to organize, to make meaning persists even through dark ages. Our modern world, with its global interdependencies and technological complexities, may be particularly vulnerable to cascading failures, to disruptions that spread rapidly across tightly coupled systems. But it is also a world with unprecedented capacity for storing and transmitting information, for documenting our present so that future archaeologists, should they need to reconstruct our civilization from fragments, will have more to work with than column bases and pottery sherds. We have learned, painfully through the study of past collapses, some things about sustainability and resilience, about the dangers of overextension and environmental degradation, about the importance of maintaining redundancy and flexibility in social systems. Whether we will apply these lessons effectively remains uncertain. History offers patterns but no guarantees, warnings but no immunity. The Bronze Age Athenians who built their citadel could not have imagined the classical city that would eventually rise on the same rock, could not have conceived of democracy or philosophy or the cultural achievements that would make Athens famous for millennia. Similarly, we cannot know what will follow our own civilization, what forms human society will take in centuries to come, whether they will remember us accurately or transform us into myth. What we can do is acknowledge our place in the long continuum of human striving, recognize our debt to the countless generations whose labor and thought made our world possible, and attempt to leave something of value, knowledge, institutions, beauty, perhaps just stories, for whatever generations follow. There is a particular kind of comfort that comes from contemplating deep history, from allowing the mind to dwell on civilizations long vanished, on people who lived and died millennia before our own birth, on the vast stretches of time that dwarf individual human lives and even entire cultures. This comfort is not escapism, not a denial of present concerns, but rather a shift in perspective that can make immediate anxieties seem less overwhelming, that can place our own troubles within a context large enough to contain them without diminishing their reality. When we think about Bronze Age Athens, about people who walked the Acropolis 3,500 years ago, who worried about harvests and water supplies and the stability of their citadel, who celebrated festivals and mourned losses and went about the business of living, we recognize something fundamental about the human condition that transcends all particularity of time and place. These people, whose names we will never know, whose faces we cannot reconstruct, whose voices are silent forever, were no less fully human than we are. They experienced joy and sorrow, hope and fear, love and loss. They made plans for futures they would never see, invested labor in structures meant to outlast them, told stories to their children about where they came from and what mattered. They were not fundamentally different from us despite the enormous technological and cultural distance that separates their world from ours, and yet their entire civilization has vanished so completely that even their memory was lost until modern archaeology began to recover fragments of their existence. This should humble us, certainly, but it can also comfort us in a strange way by reminding us that human life has value and meaning independent of whether it is remembered, that the significance of existence does not require permanence or fame, that countless generations have lived fully and completely despite leaving no trace. When we acknowledge the lost Bronze Age city beneath the classical Acropolis, when we take time to imagine what was once there, even though we can never know it fully, we perform an act of recognition that honours those vanished people. We say, in effect, that they mattered, that their lives were real, that the stone they shaped, and the walls they built, and the communities they formed were worthy of attention despite having been buried by time. This recognition is not something they can receive, of course. They're gone beyond any possibility of knowing our regard, but it changes us, the ones doing the remembering. It connects us across the abyss of millennia to the long chain of human existence, makes us aware that we too are links in that chain, temporary occupants of a world that preceded us and will continue after we are gone. There is something deeply consoling in this awareness of continuity amid change. The Acropolis endures even as civilizations rise and fall upon it. The limestone rock, shaped by geological processes incomprehensibly ancient, provides a stable foundation for human dramas that play out across centuries and then fade. The Mediterranean sun rises over the same mountains that Bronze Age farmers watched, warming the same earth, sustaining the same basic rhythms of seasonal change that governed agriculture then, and, in modified form, continue now. These continuities of geography and nature provide a kind of anchor, a reminder that beneath all human turbulence lies something more persistent, that the stage remains even after particular actors have made their exits. But perhaps the deeper comfort comes from recognizing resilience alongside fragility. Yes, Bronze Age Athens collapsed, its palace abandoned, its systems dissolved, its knowledge largely lost. Yes, this demonstrates how vulnerable human institutions are to disruption, how temporary even the seemingly permanent can prove. But human beings survived, communities adapted, knowledge was rebuilt even if in different forms. The Dark Age eventually gave way to new flowering. This pattern of catastrophe followed by adaptation, of collapse followed by recovery, of endings that become new beginnings, appears throughout human history. It suggests that while individual civilizations are mortal, human creativity and adaptability persist, that we have within us the capacity to rebuild even from devastating losses. As you prepare for sleep tonight, perhaps you can carry with you this sense of connection to the deep past, this awareness of being part of a story much larger and longer than any single lifetime. The Bronze Age Athenians who raised those Cyclopean walls were doing what humans do, building, organizing, trying to create security and meaning in an uncertain world. They succeeded for a time and then failed, as all human endeavors eventually must. But their effort was real, their lives had dignity and purpose, and the fact that we can still contemplate their existence, however dimly, creates a thread of connection across the vast distance that separates us. This is what the study of history offers at its best, not just facts and dates and explanations of how things worked, but a sense of participation in the long human story, an awareness that we are neither the beginning nor the end, but rather part of an ongoing process of living, building, trying, failing, adapting, continuing. The lost city beneath the Acropolis reminds us that everything passes, but also that everything matters while it exists, that human effort has value even when its products prove temporary, that the very act of trying to create something meaningful, a city, a civilization, a life well lived, carries significance independent of ultimate success or failure. Let the image settle in your mind as you drift towards sleep, that ancient rock crowned first with Bronze Age fortifications, then left to weather and decay, then rebuilt by archaic Greeks, then glorified by classical monuments, then serving countless other purposes across subsequent centuries, now preserved as heritage, as a place where millions come each year to contemplate human achievement and human transience. All those layers of history, all those generations of human activity, all that accumulated striving and creating and living, all of it real, all of it worthy of remembrance, all of it part of the vast tapestry of human existence that includes your own life, your own small part in the ongoing story. Return now, in imagination, to where we began, standing on the Acropolis in darkness, night settled over Athens, the marble columns of the Parthenon pale beneath starlight, the modern city spread below like a field of artificial constellations, its lights reflecting the ancient patterns above. The wind moves across the rock as it has for countless millennia, carrying the scent of time and dust, the distant sound of traffic a reminder that human activity continues here as it has, in various forms, for thousands of years. Above, the stars wheel in their courses, the same patterns that Bronze Age farmers watched to know when to plant and harvest, that guided ancient sailors across dark waters, that provided the only illumination on nights before cities glowed with electric light. Beneath your feet, beneath the marble paving and the carefully preserved remains of classical structures, beneath the layers of fill and debris from Byzantine and Ottoman periods, beneath all the accumulated building and rebuilding of centuries, lie the fragmentary traces of the Bronze Age citadel. The Cyclopean walls, portions still surviving in their lower courses, massive stones fitted together with such care that they have endured 3,000 years of weather and earthquake and human interference. The palace foundations, so thoroughly obscured by later construction that their plan can barely be guessed. The water cisterns, their sophisticated engineering forgotten for millennia. The everyday debris of human occupation, pottery sherds, tool fragments, bones from ancient meals, scattered through soil layers, awaiting patient archaeological excavation, or remaining forever undiscovered, their information locked in darkness. Think of the lives contained in those layers. Not abstract populations or statistical averages, but actual individual human beings who woke each morning and moved through their days on this rock. A woman grinding grain in the pre-dawn darkness, her hands moving in rhythms learned from her mother, teaching those same rhythms to her daughter. A child playing among the stones, imagining adventures, seeing castles and heroes where adults saw only walls and warehouses. A craftsman shaping bronze with techniques passed down through generations, taking pride in work well done, even though his name would never be recorded, his individual contribution lost in the anonymity of collaborative production. A priest or priestess, performing rituals whose meaning we cannot recover, speaking words to gods whose names we may not know, conducting ceremonies that seemed eternal to participants, but vanished when the civilization that sustained them collapsed. All of them gone. All their particular thoughts and feelings, their specific joys and sorrows, their relationships and conflicts and moments of insight or beauty, all dissolved into time as completely as morning mist under Mediterranean sun. Yet they were real. They existed. They mattered to themselves and to others who knew them. Their lives had texture and meaning, even though no record survived to document it. Even though we can speak of them only in the most general terms, inferring from parallels and possibilities rather than knowing with certainty. This is the nature of human existence, that most of it vanishes without trace, that only a tiny fraction of human experience gets preserved in any form, that the vast majority of people who have ever lived are completely forgotten within a few generations of their death. And yet here we are, thousands of years later, thinking about them, trying to understand their world, honouring their existence through the act of remembering, even though we cannot remember them individually. This is a strange and beautiful thing, this capacity for historical consciousness, for reaching across vast temporal distances to connect with lives utterly remote from our own. It does not restore those vanished people to existence. It cannot undo the losses or answer the questions or solve the mysteries, but it creates a kind of bridge, however tenuous, between past and present, acknowledging continuity amid all the changes, recognizing that human life in any era partakes of certain fundamental qualities that transcend cultural and temporal boundaries. As you stand on this hill in darkness, real or imagined, you might feel small, one person, on one night, among the countless people across countless nights who have occupied this space. But you might also feel connected, part of a long thread of human presence that stretches back into depths we can barely fathom, and will continue forward into futures we cannot predict. The Bronze Age Athenians who built their citadel here, the classical Greeks who constructed their temples, the Byzantine Christians who converted those temples to churches, the Ottoman officials who maintained fortifications, the archaeologists who excavated ruins, The tourists who visit today, the people yet unborn who will someday stand where you stand now, all are linked by this rock, by the simple fact of being here, of choosing or being brought to this particular configuration of limestone rising from the Attic plain. The stars above care nothing for human concerns. They burned before humans existed and will burn long after we are gone, following laws of physics indifferent to consciousness or meaning. Yet we, looking up at them from this ancient hill, create meaning through the act of contemplation, through telling stories that connect earth and sky, past and present, individual lives and cosmic time. The Bronze Age farmers who watch these same stars are gone, their descendants transformed beyond recognition, their civilization vanished. But the impulse that made them look up, that made them wonder about their place in the larger order of things, that made them tell stories and build structures and try to create something that might endure, that impulse remains. It lives in us, in this moment of quiet reflection, on a hill that has witnessed so much human striving, so much achievement and loss, so much life lived in the shadow of impermanence. Let the layers settle in your mind like sediment slowly accumulating. Bronze Age, Dark Age, Archaic, Classical, Hellenistic, Roman, Byzantine, Ottoman, Modern, each adding its deposit to the whole, each leaving traces that shape what comes after even when direct continuity is broken. This is the gift of deep history, this awareness of depth beneath apparent surface, of time's vast accumulation, of human persistence through transformation. We have come to the end of our journey through the lost city of Bronze Age Athens, and it is time now to acknowledge what we have learned and what must remain forever beyond our knowing. We began with a mystery, how a fortified citadel that existed for centuries, that sheltered communities and housed power, that shaped the landscape and human activity across a region, could vanish so completely that even its memory was transformed into myth. We have traced what evidence allows us to trace, reconstructed what fragmentary remains permit us to reconstruct, imagined with disciplined care what the gaps in knowledge invite us to imagine. But vast territories of Bronze Age Athenian experience remain inaccessible, sealed in silence, protected by time's erosion from any investigation. This is as it should be. Not everything can be known, not every question has an answer. Not every past can be recovered no matter how sophisticated our methods or how patient our inquiry. The honest historian, reaching the limits of available evidence, must stop and acknowledge those limits rather than filling gaps with speculation presented as fact. We cannot know who ruled from the Acropolis during its Bronze Age flowering. We cannot read their thoughts or hear their voices. We cannot walk through their palace as it actually was, or participate in their rituals or understand their beliefs with anything approaching certainty. These losses are real and permanent, and no amount of wishful thinking will restore what time has taken. Yet the act of trying to know, the effort of reconstruction and imagination guided by evidence, has value independent of how much can finally be recovered. By contemplating Bronze Age Athens, by taking seriously the fragmentary remains and working to understand what they suggest about vanished lives, we honour those people across the vast distance that separates us. We say that they mattered, that their existence was real and worthy of attention, that the mere fact of their having lived and built and struggled and eventually disappeared does not diminish the significance of their having been here, on this rock, under these same stars, breathing the same air, shaped by and shaping the same landscape we know today in its transformed state. The losses teach us humility. The fragmentary survivals teach us gratitude for what little endures. The mystery of it all, the profound not knowing that surrounds these vanished lives, teaches us acceptance of ambiguity, comfort with uncertainty, recognition that human understanding is always partial, always incomplete, always subject to revision, as new evidence emerges or new ways of interpreting old evidence develop. This intellectual humility, this awareness of the limits of knowledge, is not weakness but wisdom, not defeatism but realism about the human condition and the nature of historical inquiry. But if we have learned humility, we have also learned wonder. That human beings 3,500 years ago could conceive and execute construction projects as ambitious as the Cyclopean fortifications. That they could organize societies complex enough to coordinate labor, manage resources, maintain hierarchies, conduct trade across considerable distances. That they could create beauty in pottery and metalwork, could worship gods whose names we may not know, could tell stories to their children about where they came from and what mattered, that they could live and love and work and hope despite inhabiting a world far more uncertain and dangerous than most of us will ever experience. This capacity for creation, organization, meaning-making, this is what connects us across the millennia, what makes the study of deep history something more than antiquarian curiosity or academic exercise. The greatest monument is not marble or bronze or massive stone walls, though these may endure for thousands of years. The greatest monument is memory itself, the human capacity to reach backward through time, to honor those who came before, to learn from their achievements and failures, to carry forward something of their experience into our own present. Bronze Age Athens has no marble monuments surviving above ground. Its palace is lost. Its walls are fragmentary and buried. Its people are nameless. Yet by remembering that it existed, by taking time to contemplate its rise and fall, by allowing imagination guided by evidence to reconstruct something of what was, we create a monument of memory that, while less tangible than stone, may prove more enduring than any physical structure. As you drift now towards sleep, let the story settle quietly in your mind. The ancient rock crowned with forgotten walls, the palace that once hummed with life, now silent beneath later constructions. The people who walked these stones, whose footsteps have faded, whose voices have stilled, whose dreams and fears and daily concerns have dissolved into time, they lived, they mattered, they are gone. And yet, in this moment of quiet remembrance, they are not entirely lost. Something of them persists, not in physical form, not in documented detail, but in the awareness that they were here, that they too participated in the endless human work of trying to create meaning and security in an uncertain world, that they too are part of the long story of which we are also part, temporary participants in a drama that extends far beyond any individual lifetime or civilization. May you rest well tonight, comforted by the persistence of human creativity amid the ceaseless flow of change, by the knowledge that others before you have faced uncertainty and loss, and continued, by the quiet beauty of historical memory that connects past to present across vast distances of time. The Bronze Age Athenians sleep in their unmarked graves, forgotten by name but honoured in aggregate, their lost city a reminder of both human fragility and human resilience. And you, wherever you are, whatever your circumstances, are part of that same story, adding your own small chapter to the vast accumulation of human experience that stretches from the deepest past into unknown futures. Sleep now, in peace, surrounded by the invisible presence of all those who came before and all those who will follow. The story continues, as it always has, as it always will.